Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to address such a distinguished audience at this very important international conference. I will briefly touch 3 points: my country, my alliance, and myself. I mean my personal military experience. Starting from my country, I come from Italy, which during the last 40 years or so has been viewed by terrorists as a sort of laboratory for terrorism of different kinds. First, domestic political terrorism. I'm referring to both rightist and leftist terrorism, which have been responsible for massacres beginning in late 1969 with the bombing of a bank in Milan. This bloody period reached its top in 1978 with the kidnapping and murder of Mr. Aldo Moro, chairman of the largest Italian political party, by the so-called Red Brigades. Second, international political terrorism. During the period between 1968 and 1986, various Palestinian terrorist groups carried out some 565 terrorist attacks worldwide. Of these, 64 were perpetrated in Italy, over 11% of the total statistics, a considerable percentage. Evidently, these terrorists considered Italy as a favorable environment. Third, but not least, Italy also experienced a strong and bloody separatist wave of terrorism, which I will address later. The remedy that the Italian authorities successfully adopted against these 3 forms of terrorism was very simple: the stick and carrot approach. On one hand, emergency legislation and rigid imprisonment. On the other hand, legislation granting some privileges to those who decided to renounce terrorism and to cooperate with the authorities by providing intelligence regarding criminal groups. Let me now briefly review the third aspect of terrorism in Italy, experienced in recent history. Separatist terrorism in South Tyrol, a German-speaking northern Italian region, once part of the Austrian Empire, and subsequently incorporated by Italy at the end of World War I. This is a largely unknown and forgotten issue. Very briefly stated, the desire of a portion of the local population, maybe also the majority of the local population, to rejoin Austria resulted in a long and dangerous wave of attacks against Italian infrastructures, such as electrical power lines and military barracks, and against Italian personnel, including army, mountain and airborne troops, military police, and frontier and customs police. As a result, between 1956 and 1988, there were 361 bombing attacks with 21 persons killed, 15 military, 2 civilians, and 4 terrorists, and 57 injured, 24 military and 33 civilians. Also in this case, the remedy was the same, the stick and carrot approach. The stick entailed military measures, curfews, and trials, which resulted in 157 convictions, including in some cases also life imprisonment. In total, 103 South Tyrolean citizens, 40 from Austria and 24 from Western Germany, were found guilty. And on the other side, the carrot entailed extensive autonomy and strong financial aid granted to the region. The local population ceased supporting violent actions against the central government when it understood that the income from tourism pays much more than terrorism. This problem was definitely solved thanks to Austria's accession to the European Union on January the 1st, 1995, and thanks to the institution of the Schengen area and to the adoption of a single European currency. Today, border and customs controls no longer exist between Austria and Italy. Before 1995, on both sides of the border, there was only the same language, German. Today, we have everything in common: the blue European flag, European law regarding freedom of movement for persons and goods, and the euro as a single European currency. Can this experience be a valid lesson for the Middle East as well? It is a very difficult question indeed, but worth considering. The Middle East is unfortunately characterized by the lack of international cooperation, such as that existing in Europe, which, thanks to NATO, to the European Union, and to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has initially reduced and subsequently removed violent conflict, and as a result, also terrorism. In any case, it would be wise to undertake any possible effort in order to give way to useful confidence-building measures, such as, for example, conducting bilateral and multilateral talks. From this standpoint, the recent peace talks initiated by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mr. Abu Mazen seem to be extremely valuable. And also stressing what unites rather than what divides, or establishing free trade areas, making the best use of the historical and cultural and tourism resources, which are so numerous and significant in the Mediterranean region, and so on. Coming now to my favorite international organization, I believe that NATO, on its part, could be a catalyzing factor in the pursuit of confidence building aimed at defeating the aims of terrorism. The Atlantic Alliance is preparing a new strategic concept to be issued at the end of this year. It is foreseeable that the new concept will take into account the terrorist threat in greater measure than in the past. The current concept was issued in 1999, before 9/11. That is why it defines terrorism only as a risk rather than a threat. It is also advisable that the NATO approach be different from that of other international organizations, such as the United Nations and the European Union, which have adopted counter-terrorism strategies, whose primary task is to eliminate the causes and roots of terrorism and to counter terrorists while always respecting their human rights. Although politically correct, it is worth noting that this approach could at times be dangerous when terrorists are considered simply as victims of a phenomenon fed by the terrorists themselves. They are guilty, not victims. Among the several measures of indirect terrorism counteraction, we must not forget the opportunity offered by an interesting multinational initiative, I mean NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue, which in my opinion should be extended also to those Mediterranean countries currently excluded, like, for example, Lebanon and Syria, hoping that this will contribute to avoid the war with Israel previously foreseen by David Passig in 2020. Okay. Terrorism, in other words, is a multifaceted and unpredictable threat that cannot be countered solely by traditional means. It is advisable to use a mix of measures and to take advantage of several national and international experiences. In other words, the hard power is not sufficient. The soft power is not sufficient. It would be advisable to use a sort of smart power, a mix of the two approaches. From this standpoint, the simple formula that Italy has devised in order to defeat the domestic and not only terrorism could prove to be effective also in the case of transnational terrorism. I'm referring to the use with strong determination of a big stick whenever necessary, without forgetting a little carrot whenever possible. Concluding with my personal experience in Iraq as Deputy Commander of the Multinational Corps, today the worst nightmare for our troops is represented by the so-called IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These IEDs are a sort of revolution of the artillery. Once upon a time, artillery meant launching a grenade in the air, trying to hit the objective, which was located in a certain position. Today, the philosophy of employment of IEDs is exactly the opposite. The grenade is located in a certain position, waiting for the target, which is moving towards the grenade, and this grenade will explode when the target will be close to it. This terroristic procedure is not brand new. It has not been invented today or yesterday. The tradition is old. For example, during World War II, some attacks have been carried out by the insurgents with this procedure. But those episodes were very few because insurgents at that time didn't have the freedom of movement that they have today in Iraq or Afghanistan. The question is how to defeat them. It's very difficult to defeat them only using technology. This will lead to a never-ending escalation of measures and countermeasures without solving the problem. This is the ancient struggle between the arrow and the shield, or today between the anti-tank munitions and the armor. It's also extremely difficult to capture and kill all of them because many others will be recruited. Today, in NATO environment, many times we hear during the briefings we have captured and killed a certain number of insurgents, but this is not a significant indicator. One system could be to deny the enemy its freedom of movement, but this requires a huge number of soldiers, and professional armies of today prefer quality rather than quantity. A better system could be to eliminate the reasons of the insurgency. This is extremely difficult, but for example, among the several reasons, there is also our Western mentality of long-term commitments. We have many examples, USA in Iraq, NATO in Afghanistan. This is, in my opinion, not the correct approach from the tactical and strategic points of view. Tactically speaking, we are wrong when we counter geographically with the traditional and conventional means and with our rules of engagement, an enemy which is unconventional, not geographically limited, and an enemy who doesn't respect any rule. So in Afghanistan, we are currently using a small stick and a huge carrot, and Talibans are benefiting from this. Strategically speaking, our long-term commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan have proved to be wrong. It would have been much better to provoke the regime change and giving immediately after to the local people the responsibility of managing their own country. But instead, pretending to export the democracy in Stone Age-like countries and to stay there for decades is not correct for many reasons. First of all, this provokes a feeling of occupation in the local population. This also feeds the insurgency. Our public opinions, sooner or later, will become tired of suffering casualties every day. And we don't have to forget that the principal aim of the terror, well before killing innocent people, is exactly to provoke a wave of anti-terror. Thank you very much for your attention.